For 3 months, Lee Junho had been trapped somewhere between life and death, while his criminal empire teetered on the edge of collapse, until Keisha Williams walked into his sterile sanctuary carrying nothing but worn medical supplies and a heart too stubborn to let anyone fade away alone. At 24, Keisha Williams had mastered the art of surviving on hope and caffeine. She balanced her medical aid certification with the crushing reality that dreams of becoming a registered nurse had died the same day her grandmother's dementia diagnosis arrived with a six-figure treatment bill. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, dark eyes holding the kind of steady determination that came from watching everything fall apart and deciding to hold the pieces together anyway. She was practical, focused, and knew the exact value of every dollar she'd never had enough of. The medical temp agency had called her that morning with an unusual request, something about private family care and discretion required, but the pay rate had stopped her questions cold. She stood now in the circular driveway of what could only be described as a fortress disguised as a mansion, her beat-up Honda Civic looking like a lost child among the sleek black vehicles lined up with military precision. The Lee estate sprawled across manicured grounds in Seoul's most exclusive district, all clean lines and bulletproof glass, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted, but somehow managed to be deafening anyway. Security guards in expensive suits nodded respectfully as she approached the main entrance, their movements too smooth, too watchful, carrying the subtle weight of concealed weapons. A woman in pristine medical scrubs met her at the door, Dr. Park, the family's private physician, whose tired eyes held the particular exhaustion that came from fighting an impossible battle. "We've had the best specialists from 3 continents," she explained as they walked through corridors lined with original artwork that cost more than most people's homes. Neurologists, brain surgeons, specialists in coma rehabilitation. His brain activity is normal, all cognitive functions appear intact, but he simply will not wake up. The family is, Dr. Park paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing, becoming increasingly concerned about his condition. They entered what had once been a library but now resembled a high-end medical facility, complete with monitoring equipment that belonged in the finest hospitals and a hospital bed positioned where an antique desk might have sat. In the center of all that technology lay Lee Junho, and Keisha's breath caught despite her professional training. Even unconscious, he commanded attention, sharp features relaxed in artificial sleep, black hair perfectly styled despite 3 months of bed rest, his skin having that pale quality of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in too long. He was tall, probably mid-30s, with the kind of bone structure that belonged in magazines, dressed in expensive silk pajamas that probably cost more than her rent. The monitoring equipment painted its electronic portrait of his condition, steady heartbeat, normal brain waves, perfect vital signs that should have indicated consciousness but somehow didn't. His hands, Keisha noticed, were elegant but scarred, the kind of precise markings that spoke of violence survived rather than accidents endured. This was a man accustomed to power, to control, to bending the world to his will, now reduced to depending on machines and strangers for his very survival. "Your primary responsibility will be round-the-clock monitoring," Dr. Park continued. "Physical therapy to prevent muscle atrophy, medication administration, basic care needs. The family has been very specific that he should never be left alone. Someone must always be present in case there's any change." Keisha nodded, understanding the weight of what was being asked. She'd cared for enough patients to recognize the difference between hope and desperation, and the careful way Dr. Park spoke suggested they'd crossed that line months ago. "I'm curious, where are you from originally?" Dr. Park asked as she reviewed the medication schedule. The question seemed casual, but felt like an assessment. "North Carolina originally, but I've been in Seoul for 2 years, Keisha replied. "My grandmother always said that sometimes people just need to know someone cares enough to stay. Something about my voice, she used to tell me, made people feel less alone." The doctor's expression softened slightly, the first genuine warmth Keisha had seen since arriving. As Dr. Park left her alone with detailed instructions and emergency contacts, Keisha approached Lee Junho's bedside with the careful respect she'd learned working with vulnerable patients. "Hello, Mr. Lee," she said softly, adjusting his pillows with gentle efficiency. "My name is Keisha Williams, and I'm going to be taking care of you. I know you probably can't hear me, but I'm going to talk to you anyway, because my grandmother always said that hearing was the last thing to go and the first thing to come back. She settled into the chair beside his bed, reviewing his chart while maintaining the steady stream of one-sided conversation that had become second nature in her work. His medical history read like a testament to survival. Multiple surgeries over the years, evidence of bullets removed, knife wounds healed, the kind of injuries that painted a picture of a dangerous life lived on the edge. The shooting that had put him in this condition had been particularly severe, multiple trauma to the head and chest, miraculous survival followed by mysterious unconsciousness that defied medical explanation. "You're fighting something, aren't you?" she murmured, noting the slight tension in his jaw even in sleep. "Whatever world you're trapped in, you're not ready to give up." "That's good, because I'm not ready to give up either." Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, that steady wisdom about persistence and faith, about believing that love could reach places medicine couldn't touch. Sometimes, grandmother used to say, people just need an anchor to find their way back home. The afternoon light filtered through bulletproof windows, casting gentle shadows across Lee Junho's still form, and Keisha Williams settled in for what she suspected would be the most challenging and important job of her life. She had no idea that in the silent landscape of his unconscious mind, her voice had already begun to penetrate the darkness like a lighthouse calling a lost ship safely home. By the end of her first week, Keisha had established a rhythm that felt like conducting a symphony for an audience of one. Every morning at 6, she would enter Lee Junho's medical sanctuary with fresh coffee and quiet determination, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency before settling into the methodical routine that had become their shared daily ritual. She monitored his heart rate, administered medications through his foreline, performed the physical therapy exercises designed to prevent muscle atrophy, and maintained the steady stream of conversation that Dr. Park had initially dismissed as unprofessional but eventually came to accept as harmless. The Lee family dynamics revealed themselves gradually through careful observation and hushed conversations in the corridor outside his room. Lee Junwoo, his younger brother by 3 years, had assumed control of what Keisha gradually understood to be a vast criminal organization spanning shipping, real estate, and protection services throughout Seoul and beyond. Junwoo possessed the same sharp features as his unconscious brother, but carried himself with the careful tension of a man shouldering burdens he'd never expected to bear. He visited twice daily, morning and evening, speaking to his brother in rapid Korean that Keisha couldn't understand but recognized as business reports delivered with the respect due to a sleeping king. On Thursday morning, something shifted. Keisha was explaining the physical therapy routine to Lee Junho, her voice maintaining its usual calm cadence as she moved his left arm through range of motion exercises, when the heart monitor's steady beeping suddenly accelerated. Dr. Park, reviewing charts at the desk across the room, glanced up with mild interest. "Probably just a normal fluctuation," she noted, but Keisha had spent enough hours beside that bed to know the difference between random variation and deliberate response. She paused her explanation, watching as his heart rate gradually returned to baseline, then resumed speaking and watched it climb again. "Doctor, could you look at this?" Keisha called softly, continuing her routine while keeping one eye on the monitoring equipment. She began describing the morning's medication schedule, her voice steady and professional, and watched Junho's heart rate spike from 72 to 85 beats per minute. Dr. Park approached with scientific curiosity but obvious skepticism, observing for several minutes before shaking her head. "Coincidence," she declared. "Coma patients sometimes show autonomic responses to environmental stimuli, but it's rarely meaningful. The brain is still processing sound even when consciousness is absent." But Keisha had spent years caring for patients who couldn't communicate traditionally, and she'd learned to notice details that medical equipment missed. Over the following days, she observed changes so subtle they barely registered on the monitoring systems. When she entered the room each morning, the slight tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, as if some part of him recognized her presence and found comfort there. His breathing, normally mechanical and steady, developed a more natural rhythm during her shifts, deeper and more relaxed, like someone drifting toward peaceful sleep rather than fighting unconsciousness. Through overheard conversations between Junwoo and the security team, Keisha began to understand the scope of what Lee Junho had built before the shooting that changed everything. He'd inherited a small protection business from their father and transformed it into an empire that touched every major industry in Seoul, not through violence, but through intelligence, strategic thinking, and an uncanny ability to anticipate problems before they became crises. His reputation for cold efficiency was matched only by his reputation for keeping his word, and his unconscious state had created a power vacuum that rival organizations were beginning to test with increasing boldness. The thought of this powerful, dangerous man lying helpless stirred something protective in Keisha that surprised her with its intensity. During her afternoon shifts, she found herself talking to him about things she'd never shared with another living soul. "I dropped out of nursing school when grandmother got sick," she told him while adjusting his position to prevent bed sores. "Everyone said I should put her in a state facility, that I was throwing my future away trying to care for her myself. But she raised me when my parents died, and I couldn't abandon her when she needed me most." She described her dreams of working in pediatric nursing, her plans to specialize in caring for children with chronic illnesses, the way financial reality had forced her to accept temporary medical aid positions instead of pursuing her true calling. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just treading water," she admitted, monitoring his vital signs with automatic precision. "Like I'm watching everyone else build real lives while I'm stuck taking care of other people's emergencies and never getting to solve my own." It was during this confession that the second inexplicable response occurred. As the words "I feel so alone" sometimes escaped her lips, Lee Junho's right hand, which had remained completely motionless for 3 months according to his medical records, experienced a barely perceptible twitch. Not a spasm or involuntary muscle contraction, but a deliberate movement, fingers flexing as if reaching for something. Keisha's breath caught as she watched his hand relax back to stillness, the movement so subtle she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Dr. Park's reaction to this observation was predictably dismissive. "Muscle memory, random neural firing, completely normal in long-term coma patients," she explained with the patience of someone accustomed to family members seeing miracles in meaningless reflexes. "The brain is remarkably active even during unconsciousness, processing information and generating responses that may seem purposeful but are actually just biological noise. I understand your desire to see progress, Miss Williams, but we must be realistic about his condition." But Keisha trusted her instincts more than medical skepticism, particularly when those instincts had been honed through years of caring for patients who communicated through signs that others missed or dismissed. She'd learned to read the language of subtle responses, to distinguish between random movements and meaningful communication, and everything about Lee Junho's reactions felt intentional rather than coincidental. His vital signs stabilized during her presence, his breathing deepened when she spoke, and something about the quality of stillness in his body suggested listening rather than absence. That evening, after Dr. Park had completed her final rounds and the medical staff had shifted to minimal overnight monitoring, Keisha made a decision that would have horrified the professionals who trusted in machines over intuition. She pulled her chair closer to Lee Junho's bedside, close enough to speak in whispers that wouldn't carry to the hallway, and addressed him directly. "I think you can hear me," she said softly, her voice carrying conviction rather than hope. "I don't know why you can't wake up, but I think some part of you is fighting to come back. If that's true, if you're really listening, then I want you to know that you're not alone. Whatever you're battling in there, you don't have to face it by yourself." The heart monitor showed a gradual increase in rhythm, nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms, but consistent enough to confirm what Keisha had begun to suspect. Somewhere in the mysterious landscape of consciousness and unconsciousness, Lee Junho was aware of her presence, responding to her voice, finding some measure of comfort in her steady companionship. The man who had built an empire through control and calculation was now completely dependent on others for survival. But somehow, impossibly, he seemed to recognize that she was different from the medical professionals who treated him as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be reached. As she settled in for her overnight shift, maintaining her quiet vigil beside his bed, Keisha Williams made a professional decision that went far beyond the scope of her employment. She would trust her instincts over medical orthodoxy, believe in connection over clinical detachment, and find a way to reach the man trapped somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, no matter how impossible that task appeared to be. The first sign that Lee Junho's world had shifted from protective luxury to active battlefield came on a Tuesday morning when Keisha arrived to find the estate's security detail tripled and every guard carrying weapons that made no attempt at concealment. The men in expensive suits now wore tactical vests beneath their jackets, their movements sharp with the kind of alertness that came from expecting trouble rather than preventing it. Bulletproof vehicles had replaced the elegant sedans in the circular driveway, and the peaceful morning routine Keisha had grown accustomed to felt suddenly fragile, like a soap bubble floating above broken glass. Junwoo met her at the medical wing's entrance, his usually composed demeanor cracked with barely controlled tension. Our rivals believe this is their moment, he explained without preamble, his English precise but strained. The Nakamura syndicate from Tokyo, the Kim faction from Busan, others who've waited years for an opportunity to move against us. They see my brother's condition as weakness, a chance to claim territory that's been ours for decades. We've received intelligence that coordinated strikes are being planned within the week. The weight of what she'd walked into settled over Keisha like a lead blanket. The realization that she'd been caring for not just a coma patient, but the unconscious king of a criminal empire under siege. The medical sanctuary that had felt like a peaceful library now revealed itself as a fortress protecting the most valuable target in Seoul's underworld, and she was standing at the center of a war zone disguised as a healing space. Despite the danger swirling around the estate like gathering storm clouds, Keisha found herself drawn even deeper into Lee Junho's care with an intensity that surprised her. She began spending extra time arranging his appearance, smoothing his perfectly styled hair, adjusting his expensive silk pajamas with the careful attention of someone tending to a beloved rather than a patient. During her conversations with him, she shared details about her daily life that felt increasingly intimate, describing her grandmother's good days and difficult ones, her dreams of returning to school, her growing sense that caring for him had become something far beyond professional duty. He looked peaceful in unconsciousness, but Keisha had learned to read the subtle signs of tension that suggested some part of him remained aware of the danger surrounding his helpless form. The slight furrow between his dark brows, the way his hands occasionally clenched as if reaching for weapons he could no longer wield, the restless quality of his breathing that suggested dreams filled with violence and responsibility he couldn't escape even in sleep. "You're worried about them, aren't you?" she murmured during one of their one-sided conversations, adjusting the monitoring equipment with practiced efficiency. "Even like this, you're trying to protect your family, your organization, everyone who depends on you." The heart monitor showed the familiar spike in rhythm that had become her favorite sound in the world, confirmation that somewhere in the darkness of his unconscious mind, Lee Junho was listening and responding to her voice with increasing consistency. The test of her dedication came without warning during what the security team called a defensive drill but felt like preparation for inevitable war. Alarms screamed through the medical wing as guards shouted evacuation orders, their voices sharp with urgency as they moved through rooms gathering staff and family members for immediate relocation to the estate's reinforced panic rooms. Dr. Park appeared in the doorway with two security guards, gesturing toward the medical equipment with obvious distress. "Miss Williams, we need to move Mr. Lee immediately," the doctor called over the blaring alarms. "The transport gurney is ready, but we must evacuate now." The guards moved toward the life support systems with efficient purpose, hands reaching for cables and monitors, but Keisha stepped directly into their path with a determination that surprised even herself. "Wait," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "You can't just unplug him and hope the portable systems will maintain his stability. His vitals have been perfectly calibrated for 3 months, and shocking his system during transport could cause more damage than whatever we're evacuating from. Give me 60 seconds to properly transition him to mobile support or risk losing him entirely." Junwoo, who had arrived to oversee his brother's evacuation personally, studied Keisha with new respect as she moved through the medical equipment with professional competence, checking connections and adjusting settings with the focused intensity of someone who understood that lives depended on precision. She monitored Lee Junho's vital signs throughout the process, her calm presence seeming to stabilize him even as chaos erupted around them. "You care about him," Junwoo observed quietly as Keisha completed her preparations, his tone carrying surprise rather than accusation. "This is not just a job for you anymore." She met his gaze steadily, recognizing that some threshold had been crossed in their relationship, that she was no longer viewed as temporary medical staff, but as someone whose loyalty had been tested and proven under pressure. Before she could respond, the sounds of actual gunfire erupted from the estate's perimeter, sharp cracks echoing through bulletproof windows as the defensive drill transformed into real combat. The guards' radio chatter became urgent and specific, reporting multiple breach attempts and requesting immediate tactical support. But it was Lee Junho's response that left everyone in the medical wing staring at the monitoring equipment in shocked silence. His heart rate spiked to 120 beats per minute, blood pressure climbing to levels that should have triggered emergency protocols, brain activity showing patterns that Dr. Park had never seen in 3 months of careful observation. Most remarkably, his body seemed to tense with purpose rather than stress, muscles coiling as if preparing for action despite his complete unconsciousness. The monitoring equipment painted a picture of someone fighting to wake up, struggling against the mysterious barriers that held him trapped between worlds. Keisha moved to his bedside instinctively, placing her hand gently on his forehead while speaking in the calm, steady voice that had become their private language. "You're safe," she whispered, her words barely audible over the continuing alarms and distant gunfire. "I'm here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you're fighting in there, you don't have to do it alone. Your family is protected, your people are holding the line, and you can rest knowing everything you built is being defended." The effect was immediate and undeniable. His vital signs began stabilizing under her voice, heart rate gradually returning toward normal ranges, muscle tension easing as if her presence provided some kind of anchor in whatever storm was raging through his unconscious mind. Dr. Park watched the monitoring equipment with growing amazement, unable to dismiss what she was witnessing as coincidence or medical anomaly. "The pattern is unmistakable," she admitted reluctantly, reviewing the data that had accumulated over weeks of careful observation. "His responses are strongest during your presence, Miss Williams. His vital signs stabilize when you speak, his brain activity increases when you enter the room, and now this. During a genuine crisis, he responds to your voice in ways that suggest conscious awareness despite his unconscious state." As the sounds of battle faded from the estate's perimeter and security confirmed that the threats had been neutralized, Keisha remained beside Lee Junho's bed with the growing certainty that their connection transcended anything medical science could explain or professional boundaries could contain. "He can hear me," she said aloud, the words carrying conviction rather than hope. "Somehow, he knows I'm here, and he's fighting to come back." The realization settled over her like a revelation and a responsibility combined, the understanding that she had become something far more important than a hired caretaker in Lee Junho's battle for consciousness. She was his lifeline, his anchor, the voice calling him back from whatever darkness held him captive. And if conventional medicine couldn't reach him, then perhaps it was time to try something that medical textbooks would consider impossible, but her grandmother's wisdom whispered might actually work. The conversation that would change everything began during the quiet hours before dawn, when the medical wing settled into the peaceful rhythm that Keisha had come to treasure above all other sounds in the world. Lee Junwoo entered his brother's sanctuary with the careful quiet of someone approaching sacred ground, his expensive suit immaculate despite the early hour, dark eyes carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be postponed any longer. He positioned himself across from where Keisha sat beside the bed, his posture formal but respectful, like a diplomat preparing for negotiations that would determine the fate of kingdoms. "Miss Williams," he began, his English measured and precise, "I believe it's time we discussed your future here more formally. What you've accomplished with my brother goes far beyond the scope of temporary medical assistance. Dr. Park has documented responses that she's never seen in 15 years of coma treatment, improvements that coincide directly with your presence and care. My family has concluded that your role here has become not just beneficial but essential to his recovery. Keisha felt the shift in atmosphere, the recognition that this was no longer a conversation between employer and employee, but something far more significant and binding. The monitoring equipment hummed softly in the background, painting its electronic portrait of Lee Junho's steady vital signs, while morning light began filtering through bulletproof windows that had become as familiar as her own bedroom walls over the past weeks. We would like to offer you a permanent position as my brother's exclusive medical caretaker, Junwoo continued, producing a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to fund her grandmother's care for months. The terms are comprehensive: $150,000 annually, paid monthly, with full medical benefits extending to your grandmother's specialized care. We will provide you with a private apartment on the estate grounds, equipped with everything necessary for your comfort and privacy. The numbers hit Keisha like physical blows, amounts of money she'd never imagined having access to, solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable just weeks ago. Her grandmother's medical bills, the specialized memory care facility she'd dreamed of affording, the nursing education she'd abandoned, all of it suddenly within reach through an offer that felt both miraculous and terrifying in its implications. Your responsibilities would be exactly what you're already providing, Junwoo explained, his tone remaining businesslike even as he outlined terms that would transform her entire existence. Exclusive medical care for my brother, reporting directly to family members only, maintaining absolute discretion regarding anything you observe or learn while in our employment. You would have full authority over his medical routine, with Dr. Park providing consultation but deferring to your judgment regarding his daily care. But Keisha understood enough about the Lee family's world to recognize that generous offers in their sphere came with corresponding expectations and consequences. What happens if I want to leave? She asked quietly, her practical nature demanding clarity about the boundaries of this golden cage being offered to her. What happens if your brother recovers and no longer needs this level of care? What happens if I make a mistake that costs rather than helps? Junwoo's expression remained carefully neutral, but something in his dark eyes suggested he'd been waiting for exactly these questions. If you choose to leave after my brother's recovery, you would receive a substantial severance payment and excellent references for any future medical position you might pursue. However, he paused, allowing the weight of unspoken implications to settle between them. The discretion regarding our family's affairs would remain absolute and permanent. The consequences for betraying that trust would be severe and non-negotiable. The threat was delivered with elegant politeness, but Keisha had learned to read the language of power that the Lee family spoke fluently. She would be entering their world completely, accepting not just employment, but a form of adoption into a criminal organization that protected its secrets with lethal efficiency. There would be no casual departure, no simple resignation letter, no walking away without consequences that extended far beyond lost income. She looked at Lee Junho's peaceful face, studying the sharp features that had become more familiar than her own reflection, remembering the subtle responses that had convinced her of his awareness despite medical skepticism. Her grandmother's medical bills flashed through her mind, the mounting debt that threatened to force impossible choices between her education and her family's care, the grinding exhaustion of temporary positions that paid enough to survive, but never enough to build anything lasting. I need to know that I'll have the freedom to try unconventional approaches, she said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was considering. If I'm going to be his exclusive caretaker, I need your family's support for methods that might seem unorthodox to medical professionals. I believe I can reach him in ways that traditional treatment hasn't, but I'll need permission to operate outside standard protocols. Junwoo leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening with genuine interest. What kind of approaches are you considering, Miss Williams? Dr. Park has been very conservative in her treatment plan, focused primarily on maintaining his physical stability rather than actively pursuing consciousness recovery. If you believe there are possibilities she hasn't explored, my family would be very interested in your recommendations. The unthinkable method had been forming in Keisha's mind for days. Built from fragments of unconventional wisdom her grandmother had shared about reaching people who seemed unreachable. I want to treat him like someone who's trapped rather than someone who's absent, she explained, feeling her way through ideas that medical textbooks would reject, but her instincts insisted might work. I want to bring elements of his world into this room, familiar scents and sounds that might anchor him to consciousness. I want to talk to him about his business, his responsibilities, the people counting on his recovery, rather than limiting conversation to medical pleasantries. She gathered courage from Jun-woo's attentive silence, pressing forward with plans that felt both inspired and terrifying. I want to try direct communication with his subconscious, speaking to whatever part of him is fighting to return and giving him specific reasons to complete that fight. I believe he's aware but trapped, not absent but unreachable through conventional means. If I'm wrong, we lose nothing but time. If I'm right, we might bring him back. The proposal settled between them like a contract written in possibilities rather than certainties, an agreement that would bind her future to the fate of an unconscious crime boss whose response to her voice had become the most important sound in her carefully structured world. Jun-woo studied her with the calculating assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating investments and determining which risks were worth taking. I accept, Keisha said before she could reconsider the magnitude of what she was choosing. I'll do whatever it takes to help him wake up. The words carried the weight of commitment that transcended employment, a promise that acknowledged she was crossing a threshold from which there might be no safe return. That evening, after Dr. Park had completed her rounds and the medical staff had settled into minimal overnight monitoring, Keisha implemented the first phase of her unthinkable method. She dimmed the institutional lighting and introduced small battery-powered speakers that filled the room with the kind of classical music that seemed to match Lee Jun-ho's sophisticated tastes. She brought subtle scents that suggested wealth and power rather than medical sterility, expensive cologne and leather that connected to the world he'd built rather than the medical facility where he was trapped. Most importantly, she changed the nature of her conversations entirely, abandoning medical small talk for direct communication with the part of his mind that she believed remained conscious and aware. I know you can hear me, Jun-ho, she said, using his given name for the first time and placing her hand gently on his forehead. I know you're fighting to come back, and I want to help you win that fight. Your brother is handling everything perfectly, but he needs you to return. Your organization is strong, but it was built by your vision and it needs your leadership. The monitoring equipment registered changes immediately, brainwave patterns shifting into configurations that Dr. Park would later describe as unprecedented in her experience with coma patients. His eyes moved beneath closed lids with the rapid, darting motion characteristic of REM sleep, suggesting dream activity or conscious thought processing that had been absent for months. His heart rate developed a rhythmic quality that seemed almost conversational, rising and falling in response to specific words and topics, as if he were participating in dialogue through the only means available to him. You're not alone in there, Keisha whispered, her voice carrying conviction and tenderness in equal measure. I'm here with you, and I'll stay as long as it takes to guide you home. But you have to keep fighting, you have to keep reaching toward consciousness, because there's a world full of people who need you to come back to them. For the first time since his injury, Lee Jun-ho's breathing deepened into patterns that suggested natural sleep rather than unconscious suspension, and Keisha Williams understood that she had crossed far beyond the boundaries of professional medical care into something that felt dangerously close to love. The first flutter of Lee Jun-ho's eyelids came during Keisha's morning routine, a barely perceptible movement that she might have missed if she hadn't been watching his face with the focused attention of someone who'd memorized every angle and shadow of his features over the past month. His dark lashes trembled against his pale cheeks, not the random twitching of unconscious muscle movement, but something deliberate and purposeful, as if he were testing the weight of consciousness after months of floating in darkness. Stay with me, she whispered, leaning closer to his bedside while maintaining her gentle touch on his forehead. I know you're fighting to come back. Take your time, but don't give up now. His eyes remained closed, but his breathing shifted into patterns that suggested awareness rather than unconscious suspension, deeper and more controlled, like someone choosing to rest rather than someone trapped in medical limbo. Over the following days, Lee Jun-ho began existing in a strange twilight state between consciousness and sleep, his awareness ebbing and flowing like tides that responded to mysterious lunar cycles only he could sense. Dr. Park documented periods of increased brain activity that coincided perfectly with Keisha's presence, noting pupil responses and muscle coordination that suggested cognitive function returning in carefully measured increments. But the most remarkable discovery was that his moments of greatest alertness occurred exclusively during Keisha's shifts, as if her voice carried some frequency that could penetrate the barriers holding him suspended between worlds. When Dr. Park or other medical staff approached his bedside, Lee Junho would slip back into complete unconsciousness, his vital signs flatlining into the steady patterns they'd maintained for months. But during Keisha's care sessions, his eyes would occasionally open, unfocused but aware, tracking movement and responding to sounds with the sluggish precision of someone relearning how to interpret sensory information. The monitoring equipment painted portraits of a mind awakening by degrees, consciousness returning in fragments that assembled slowly into something approaching normal brain function. The intimate nature of caring for someone hovering between unconsciousness and awareness created a bond that transcended anything Keisha had experienced in her medical training. She helped him through physical therapy exercises while his eyes remained partially open, watching her face with an intensity that suggested recognition even when words remained impossible. She fed him carefully prepared nutrition supplements, monitoring his ability to swallow and process food while speaking to him in the calm, steady voice that had become their private language. She read him business reports that Junwoo provided, updates about the organization's operations and challenges, watching his vital signs spike with what seemed like engaged interest rather than stress. During these semi-conscious moments, Lee Junho's personality began emerging through subtle responses that spoke more clearly than words. His eyes would narrow slightly when she mentioned rival organizations, suggesting protective instincts that survived even neurological trauma. His breathing would deepen when she described successful business negotiations, indicating satisfaction with his subordinates' work. Most remarkably, his expression would soften whenever she shared personal details about her grandmother's condition or her own fears about the future, revealing an empathy that survived beneath layers of unconsciousness. The breakthrough moment arrived without fanfare during what should have been an ordinary afternoon medication session. Keisha was preparing to leave for her scheduled break, gathering her notes and preparing to hand his care over to the evening medical staff when she felt pressure around her fingers. Lee Junho's hand, which had remained motionless except for involuntary twitches, had moved deliberately to grasp hers with surprising strength. His eyes opened fully for the first time, dark and unfocused but unmistakably aware, and his lips moved with enormous effort to form a single word. "Stay," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to having his requests honored without question. The word was rough from months of disuse, but the meaning was crystal clear, a direct plea that bypassed medical protocols and spoke to the personal connection that had developed between them. Keisha's breath caught as she realized she was witnessing not just neurological recovery, but conscious recognition, acknowledgement that he knew who she was and valued her presence above all other considerations. Over the following weeks, they developed a communication system built around gentle pressure and careful eye contact, his ability to squeeze her hand serving as confirmation for yes or no questions about his comfort, pain levels, and basic needs. Keisha learned to read the subtle expressions that crossed his features during their conversations, recognizing when he was tired, frustrated, or simply content to listen to her voice. The medical staff marveled at his responsiveness during her shifts while noting his complete unconsciousness whenever she was absent, a pattern so consistent it defied conventional understanding of coma recovery. During these intimate caretaking sessions, Keisha began to understand Lee Junho not as the dangerous criminal leader she'd heard described, but as a complex man who carried visible reminders of a life lived on the edge of violence. His body told stories through carefully mapped scars, surgical marks from bullet removals, knife wounds that had healed with the precision of expensive medical care, evidence of someone who'd survived numerous attempts on his life through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer determination. The contrast between his current vulnerability and the obvious danger he'd faced created a protective instinct in Keisha that surprised her with its fierce intensity. She found herself sharing increasingly personal details during their one-sided conversations, describing her grandmother's decline with an honesty she'd never offered to anyone else. Some days she remembers me perfectly, laughs at our old jokes, asks about my nursing school plans like I just started yesterday. She told him while monitoring his physical therapy progress. Other days she doesn't recognize my face, calls me by my mother's name, gets scared when I try to help her eat. It's like watching someone I love disappear by degrees, and I don't know how to save her. Lee Junho's eyes, which had been tracking her movements during the therapy session, focused on her face with unmistakable sympathy. His hand moved with deliberate effort to squeeze hers twice, their established signal for understanding and comfort, and she saw something in his expression that suggested he recognized the pain of watching loved ones suffer beyond his ability to protect or heal them. The growing intimacy of their connection was interrupted by increasingly urgent security briefings that Junwoo delivered during his evening visits. Intelligence reports suggested that rival organizations had identified Lee Junho's vulnerable state as an opportunity for permanent elimination, with assassination attempts being planned to coincide with his expected transfer to a long-term care facility. The medical wing's defenses had been reinforced, but the threat remained credible and immediate, requiring decisions about his safety that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Keisha's response to these warnings surprised everyone, including herself, with its vehement protectiveness. She refused to consider reducing her hours or accepting additional security personnel in the medical wing, arguing that any disruption to their established routine might interfere with his recovery process. When Junwoo suggested temporarily relocating Lee Junho to a more secure facility, she became adamant about maintaining the environment where his progress had been most significant, insisting that moving him would undo weeks of careful advancement. "You don't understand," she told the assembled family members and security experts with a conviction that brooked no argument. "He's fighting to come back, and he's using my voice as an anchor. If you change his environment or introduce strangers into his care routine, you risk losing the progress he's made. I won't let that happen. I won't abandon him when he's finally finding his way home." It was during this passionate defense of her patient that Lee Junho achieved his moment of clearest consciousness since the shooting. His eyes opened fully and focused with sharp precision on Keisha's face, recognition flooding his features as he struggled to form words with a voice that carried whispers of his former authority. "You brought me back," he managed to say, each word requiring tremendous effort, but carrying unmistakable meaning. "The machines, doctors, nothing worked until you. Your voice in the darkness, calling me home." The monitoring equipment recorded brain activity levels that Dr. Park declared completely normal, cognitive function that indicated full consciousness returning in progressive waves, and vital signs that suggested someone fighting to remain awake rather than someone trapped in unconsciousness. But it was the expression in Lee Junho's dark eyes that told the real story, gratitude and recognition, and something deeper that suggested their connection had transcended the boundaries between patient and caretaker into territory that felt dangerously close to devotion. Lee Junho's complete awakening coincided with the sound of gunfire erupting from the estate's main security perimeter, sharp cracks that shattered the peaceful morning routine and sent alarm systems screaming through bulletproof corridors with urgent electronic warnings. Keisha was adjusting his position for morning physical therapy when his eyes snapped open with the focused clarity of someone emerging from deep sleep rather than months of unconsciousness, dark pupils dilating as his mind processed the familiar sounds of combat with the automatic assessment of someone whose survival had always depended on calculating threats with lethal precision. His first words carried the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to commanding in crisis situations, voice rough from disuse, but sharp with intelligence that had remained intact despite months of medical suspension. "Where is Keisha?" he demanded, his gaze searching the medical wing with protective intensity before settling on her face with visible relief. "The rivals. They're using my condition as opportunity for final strike. How many? How long do we have?" The questions came in rapid succession as Lee Junho struggled to sit upright despite obvious physical weakness, muscles that had been maintained through Keisha's careful therapy responding sluggishly to commands from a mind that was operating at full capacity for the first time since the shooting. His hands moved instinctively toward weapons that weren't there, years of trained responses asserting themselves even as his body reminded him of months spent in medical dependency. "Mr. Lee, you need to remain calm," Keisha began, but he cut her off with a gesture that carried absolute authority despite his prone position in a medical bed surrounded by monitoring equipment that still painted electronic portraits of his returning vital functions. "No, you need to understand what's happening. They've been waiting for this moment, when they believed I was weak, defenseless, unable to respond to direct attack." Junwoo appeared in the doorway with security personnel, his expression mixing relief at his brother's consciousness with urgent tactical concern. "The Nakamura Syndicate, 3 vehicles, professional assault team," he reported with military efficiency. "They've breached the outer perimeter and are advancing toward the main compound." Lee Junho's transformation from vulnerable patient to lethal strategist occurred with frightening speed, his mind engaging with crisis management as if the months of unconsciousness had been merely an extended planning session. Keisha watched in fascination and growing terror as the gentle man, who had communicated through hand squeezes and whispered gratitude, revealed himself as someone capable of orchestrating violence with the same precision he'd once applied to building criminal empires. "Activate Protocol 7, he instructed Junwoo with calm authority that belied his physical condition. "Full tactical response, no prisoners, complete elimination of threat. And bring me secure communication access immediately. I need to coordinate directly with our perimeter teams." His brother nodded with obvious relief, recognizing the return of leadership that their organization had been missing for months. But even as he issued commands with the cold efficiency that had made him legendary in Seoul's underworld, Lee Junho's primary concern remained focused on Keisha's safety rather than his own recovery or organizational defense. "You will remain in this room," he told her with gentle firmness that nonetheless carried the weight of non-negotiable instruction. "The medical wing is the most secure location on the estate, and I need to know you're protected while I handle this situation." The distant sounds of systematic gunfire and tactical coordination filtered through bulletproof walls as Lee Junho directed defensive operations from his medical bed, speaking in rapid Korean to security commanders while monitoring enemy movements through surveillance systems that Junwoo had connected to portable devices. Keisha remained beside him throughout the crisis, watching his vital signs spike with adrenaline and purpose rather than medical distress, understanding that she was witnessing the return of someone who had built an empire through intelligence and strategic thinking rather than random violence. What happened over the next several hours was conducted with the kind of professional efficiency that left no evidence of the methods employed, but the results were absolute and permanent. The Nakamura Syndicate's assault team simply vanished, their vehicles found abandoned and empty, their communications systems mysteriously silent, their planned coordinated strike against the Lee organization ending not in victory, but in complete disappearance that sent unmistakable messages throughout Seoul's criminal community about the consequences of underestimating Lee family resources. When Lee Junho finally disconnected from tactical communications and allowed his body to collapse back against the medical bed, exhaustion replacing adrenaline as the immediate threat was neutralized permanently, Keisha saw vulnerability return to features that had been mask-like with concentrated authority during the crisis. The man who had just orchestrated the elimination of enemies with cold precision now looked at her with gratitude and something deeper that suggested their connection had become far more significant than patient and caretaker. "I could hear you," he said quietly, his voice carrying conviction rather than confusion as he began explaining the impossible experience of consciousness trapped within unconsciousness. "Every word you spoke, every conversation, every moment you spent beside this bed talking to someone you believed couldn't respond. I was drowning in darkness, fighting to surface, and your voice became the only anchor that kept me from disappearing completely into that void." The vulnerability in his admission created intimacy that transcended anything physical, the recognition that she had literally saved him from a fate worse than death by refusing to give up when medical science had exhausted its options. During those months when doctors measured his survival through vital signs and brain activity, Keisha had been conducting a different kind of medical intervention, one that reached parts of human experience that monitoring equipment couldn't detect or measure. I was losing myself, Lee Junho continued, his dark eyes holding hers with intensity that made her breath catch. Before the shooting, I had become someone I didn't recognize, cold and calculating and focused only on power and control. The violence, the constant vigilance, the necessity of eliminating threats before they eliminated me. I was becoming a monster who happened to be successful rather than a man who had chosen a dangerous path for protective reasons. He reached for her hand with movements that were deliberate despite his obvious fatigue, fingers intertwining with hers as he shared the backstory that explained everything about his character and motivations. My sister was murdered by someone I should have protected her from, someone whose threat I failed to recognize until it was too late. I built this organization, accumulated this power, surrounded myself with weapons and loyal people, all to ensure that no one under my protection would ever be vulnerable the way she was vulnerable. But somewhere in that process, I lost track of why protection mattered, became focused on control rather than care, on eliminating threats rather than preserving what was worth protecting. Your voice during those months reminded me that strength without compassion is just organized cruelty, that power without purpose is worthless regardless of its scope or efficiency. The emotional weight of his confession settled between them like a bridge connecting two people who had found something rare and precious in circumstances that should have made connection impossible. Keisha understood that she was hearing not just explanation but transformation, the moment when someone who had been lost in darkness chose to step toward light that she had somehow managed to maintain during their months of one-sided communication. "You're mine now," Lee Junho said with quiet intensity that carried both claim and promise, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was declaring. "Not as a patient who depends on your medical skills, but as the woman who saved my soul when I had forgotten it was worth saving. You brought me back from a place where I was disappearing, and I will spend whatever life I have left ensuring that you never have to face darkness alone." The possession in his words should have frightened her, but Keisha recognized it as the ultimate form of protection rather than control, the promise of someone who understood the difference between claiming ownership and accepting responsibility for another person's well-being and happiness. "And you're mine," she replied, her voice carrying equal conviction as she acknowledged feelings that had grown far beyond professional duty into something that felt like destiny. "Broken pieces and all, darkness and light together, whatever you've done and whatever you'll need to do to keep us safe. I choose this life, your world, our future together." The commitment that followed was formalized with the kind of precision that characterized everything important in Lee Junho's carefully constructed world. Within weeks, Keisha became not just his medical caretaker but his wife, her legal status providing protection that extended to her grandmother's comprehensive care and her own security within an organization that had learned to respect her influence over their previously invincible leader. But more significantly, Lee Junho began transforming the nature of his empire itself, using legitimate medical initiatives and community healthcare programs to transition away from purely criminal operations toward enterprises that protected and healed rather than threatened and destroyed. Keisha's nursing background became the foundation for clinics that served communities overlooked by traditional medical systems, her compassion balancing his strategic thinking to create something that honored both their strengths. 3 months after his awakening, Lee Junho stood beside his wife in the medical wing that had been converted into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center, watching her train staff in unconventional patient care techniques that emphasized human connection alongside medical intervention. The monitoring equipment that had once tracked his journey back to consciousness now served patients who needed advocates willing to fight for recoveries that seemed impossible to conventional medicine. She had walked into his world carrying nothing but determination and grandmother's wisdom about the power of refusing to abandon people who seemed unreachable. She had awakened not just his body but his humanity, proving that sometimes the most sophisticated medical intervention was simply the presence of someone who cared enough to stay when staying seemed pointless. Lee Junho wrapped his arms around his wife as she completed her evening rounds, both of them surrounded by the quiet sounds of healing rather than violence, protection offered through medicine rather than weapons. She was no longer fighting to save a man trapped between worlds. and he was no longer drowning in darkness that had threatened to consume everything good about the person he had once been. They had found each other in the space between consciousness and unconsciousness, between hope and despair, between the person he had been and the person she helped him become. And in building a life together, they proved that sometimes salvation comes not through dramatic rescue, but through the simple decision to remain present when presence seems to make no difference, trusting that love can reach places that medicine cannot touch and heal wounds that violence cannot protect.